Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués invités, bonsoir. My name is Maurice Lévesque, the Dean of the Faculty of the Social Science. J'aimerais vous souhaiter la bienvenue à tous et à toutes pour cette troisième édition de la prestigieuse série de conférences Fun in Kush Sing. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for being with us this evening. Nous sommes ravis de pouvoir accueillir parmi nous M. Ralph Nader ainsi que nos panélistes. Cet événement est une occasion idéale pour aborder des questions de fond et des thématiques d'actualité et chères à la Faculté des sciences sociales. Tout aussi important ce soir, c'est pour nous le moment de célébrer le 50e anniversaire du département de criminologie. Je vous propose donc, dans un premier temps, de retracer brièvement l'histoire du département, ses ambitions, ses orientations d'hier et d'aujourd'hui. Dans les années 60, les universités sont en plein essor. De nouveaux départements sont créés, et en particulier dans le domaine des sciences sociales. Se dessine une grande demande pour former des professionnels criminologues spécialisés pour intervenir en milieu carcéral. En effet, la nécessité de réformer le système pénal et de rendre les peines plus humaines et favorables à la réinsertion sociale sont au cœur du débat. C'est dans ce contexte que le département de criminologie de l'Université d'Ottawa verra le jour en 1968, avec sa maîtrise professionnelle. Non seulement on y travaille à classifier délits et délinquants selon des caractéristiques individuelles et sociales précises, mais on étudie aussi l'impact potentiel des interactions de ces derniers avec les intervenants correctionnels. Dans les années 80, on assiste à un grand virage dans le milieu. On se tourne davantage vers la critique, la recherche, l'analyse des politiques carcérales avec une orientation davantage centrée sur le social. Pour sa part, la décennie 2000 sera marquante pour le département de criminologie. On y voit naître un programme de doctorat, une chaire de recherche du Canada, un laboratoire d'études et de recherche sur la justice, l'Institut pour la prévention de la criminalité, ainsi qu'une chaire de recherche facultaire avec pour thème la prison dans la culture dans la prison. De nouveau, le département est complètement sorti du cadre traditionnel de la criminologie, comme en témoigne le programme Walls to Bridge, qui jumelle dans un même cours des étudiants réguliers de l'Université d'Ottawa et des étudiants incarcérés en centre de détention. Du même souffle, au niveau de la recherche, on se penche sur une multitude de champs considérés comme marginalisés, qui vont de la torture au théâtre en prison, du sang contaminé à l'immigration, du trafic de réfugiés à la justice biocriminelle, j'en passe. En somme, professeurs et étudiants s'intéressent à l'étude des normes, mais aussi aux acteurs qui les instaurent et ceux qui les contrôlent. Aujourd'hui, 50 ans plus tard, le département peut célébrer fièrement ses réalisations, sa multidisciplinarité, mais aussi l'engagement de ses professeurs envers ses étudiants. Maintenant, j'aimerais vous présenter le directeur du département de criminologie, M. Michael Kemper, qui introduira M. Singh, qui prendra la parole par la suite. Mais avant, je m'en voudrais de passer sous silence. Sur ça, j'inviterai donc monsieur le professeur Kemper à prendre la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Doyen, and welcome everybody. The Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa gratefully acknowledges that the land on which we gather is traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As Canadians, we're grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play here, and we thank those who have served as stewards of this special place. Recognition of the important contributions of Indigenous peoples is consistent with our department's and our broader university's commitment to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. So thank you very much for joining us here this evening. Tonight, Mr. Ralph Nader is here with us as a contribuent to the Sean and Kush Singh Distinguished Lectured Series. Thanks to the Singh's very generous donation to our university, we're able to bring leading scholars, political and community leaders from around the world to share their insights and inspiration with us. Now, our main speaker tonight, who will be introduced by the Singhs in a moment, has incisively pointed out that the U.S. tax code and the broader regulatory financial system is in fact so complex that fewer people understand it than Einstein's theory of relativity. And that is no doubt true. But amongst the select group of people who in fact do understand it, we must surely count our donors this evening. Sean Singh, this is for the reason that Sean Singh is General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at a multi-billion-dollar investment firm in New York, ensuring that hedge fund investment advisors stay on the right side of complex regulatory procedures. This is not a job for the faint of heart, and it is certainly not one for someone who cannot multitask. Multitasking is something that the Singhs do in spades. In addition to being a Big Apple finance lawyer, he has a parallel career as a film producer. Along with Michael Wexler, he has co-founded Rowish Productions, which is so named as a blend of the names of their children. Rowish Production is the main company behind the featured film Altered Minds, a major thriller piece starring Judd Hirsch. And Mr. Singh is also executive producer of a documentary scheduled for release later this year, very wide interest here, about the search for 52, the so-called loneliest whale in the world. In his spare time, Mr. Singh is also on the board of directors for crowdfunder.com. Perhaps you heard of them. They're the largest equity crowdfunding leader for sourcing and funding high-growth ventures with a network of over 130,000 entrepreneurs and investors. Similarly, Ms. Kush Singh's accomplishments cannot be put into tidy compartments. She's at once a makeup artist, a producer, director, broadcast journalist, and business person. She is the CEO of M Karma Cosmetics and Karma Portfolios, with her own line of beauty products sold in 5 countries in Southeast Asia and the US. She's also the author of 2 books. She has produced and directed several shorts, reality TV shows, and movies under the banner of her production company, M Karma, and she's also produced her first feature, along with the aforementioned Michael Wexler, Jonathan Sanger, and Rick Porras, called The Red Robin. So they are certainly quite a couple, and we very much appreciate their generosity. I would like to jump back to Sean on one very important point, and that's that we're proud to say he started out in very many important ways at the University of Ottawa as a political science student graduating in 1999. All I can say is we can just imagine where Sean would be now if he had studied criminology instead. However, our loss was clearly political science's gain, and all of the Faculty of Social Sciences is currently the winner as we continue to put the generous resources the Singhs kindly share with us to use in this speaker series and in scholarships for doctoral students. So on that note, I invite our hosts to come up this evening to introduce themselves and our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It is true, the tax code is, yay, 5 volumes in the U.S., and I'm lucky to say I don't read it at all. But I'm very privileged to be a University of Ottawa grad, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity tonight to introduce Mr. Ralph Nader. At the University of Ottawa, we like to defy the conventional, encourage our community to dare, challenge the status quo, and make the impossible possible. Who better can represent this motto than Mr. Nader himself? Ralph Nader has made America a better place through his analysis and advocacy, which have enhanced public awareness, increased government and corporate accountability. His example has inspired a whole generation of consumer advocates, citizen activists, and public interest lawyers who in turn have established their own organizations throughout the U.S. He first made headlines as a young attorney in 1965 with his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, a scathing indictment that took to task the auto industry for producing unsafe vehicles. The book led to congressional hearings and the passage of a series of automobile safety laws in 1966. Not an easy task. Mr. Nader also went on to found a wide variety of organizations, all aimed at advancing corporate and government accountability. An author, lecturer, attorney, and political activist, Mr. Nader's lifelong work has led to safer cars, healthier food, safer drugs, cleaner air and drinking water, and safer work environments. Time magazine has called him U.S.'s toughest customer. The New York Times has said of him that what sets Mr. Nader apart is that he has moved beyond social criticism to effective political action. Mr. Nader continues to work relentlessly to advance meaningful civic institutions and civic participation as an antidote to corporate and government unaccountability. As he often says, there can be no daily democracy without daily citizenship. Kush and I would like to thank Mr. Nader for honoring us with his presence tonight and for sharing his experiences and thoughts firsthand with the entire University of Ottawa community. Please join us in welcoming Mr. Nader to the stage.
Thank you very much, Sean and Kush, for your support here at your alma mater over the years. Canada has given so much to the United States. I mentioned at dinner, it's about time the United States gives back a little to Canada. We learned that from a book we put out called Canada First in 1993. And Canadians themselves don't know how much they've given to the U.S. But one thing that was a spectacular gift was people in Quebec started a credit union and came down over 100 years ago to people in New Hampshire and showed them how to start a credit union, and now 80 million Americans belong to credit unions. So that's just one example. The subject of corporate crime, state crime, and accountability is a very intense and very complex one. And I recall that the Australian corporate crime scholar John Braithwaite once said that in order to get anything done in this area, we need a culture in which corporate crime is not tolerated. And that means we need facts. That means we need to get through the frequent media blackout on corporate crime compared to street crime. We need to get through law schools who are oblivious and only recently even had courses on corporate crime. I never had a course on corporate crime at Harvard Law School. They didn't even have a course on white-collar crime. And we need to get through the kind of brilliant strategic thinking that corporate lawyers for the last 100 years have put forward in order to game the system so that raw corporate political and economic power dominate the law, shape it, misshape it, replace it, twist it, boomerang it, and exploit it. There's always a tension between raw power in any society and the rule of law. And that tension goes back and forth depending on certain social justice movements. But the relentless desire for corporations to achieve predictability translates into an unlimited desire for control. And so the commercial system collides against more and more boundaries and goes through them, when in prior years these boundaries were considered not properly breached. And so now, for example, you have corporations exploiting children with direct marketing, bypassing parental authority, selling them junk food, junk drink, violent programming, etc. That was verboten 60 years ago. When I was a kid, they sold, maybe directly, they would sell us bubble gum. They never dared have a multi-billion-dollar industry marketing direct to 7, 6, 8, 9-year-olds. There are many other boundaries that have been breached. And to put it in a benign fashion, corporations engage in strategic planning. Strategic planning means you want to control unpredictable events. And if you don't have the rule of law strongly creating boundaries, reflecting widespread social and civic and moral values, strategic planning dominates the entire economy and society. And so we know on modest reflection that over the last 70, 80 years, corporations have been strategically planning our food, where it comes from, how it's processed, how it's marketed, how it appeals to taste over nutrition, how it seduces the young, how it's increasing an epidemic of obesity and juvenile diabetes. The corporations have been planning our addictions, tobacco, alcohol, over promotion of opiates. That's part of strategic planning. It's full of marketing and advertising, and as long as it's considered legal, it becomes part of the corporate culture. And normally very good people who teach Sunday school and are otherwise very kind to their families participate in the tobacco industry, in the chemical polluting industry, in the drug industries, deceptions and manipulations and harms. I made a list recently about where corporations are strategically planning. They're strategically planning in the United States our foreign policy and military budget. Not entirely, there are other elements, but if you talk about our military budget, you have to talk about the unlimited desire of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics for more and more weapons of mass destruction in a post-Soviet Union era. They're strategically planning our healthcare system. In the United States, we have a pay-or-die healthcare system for tens of millions of people. If they can't pay outrageous prices for drugs, or they cannot have health insurance that's affordable, they die. A Harvard University Medical School study a few years ago estimated 45,000 Americans die every year because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. They are strategically planning our educational system, trying to commercial and vocationalize it over the liberal arts, over dissent. The Koch brothers are deep into the university system, so deep there's now a group to challenge them called Uncoke the Campus. They're strategically planning our genetic inheritance. Monsanto doesn't make any bones about it. They have patented thousands of gene sequences, not just flora and fauna, but human gene sequences. In other words, they have turned it into a property right. They have strategically planned our environment by deciding how much air, water pollution, soil erosion is going to occur that they can get away with. That's called externalities. To the extent that they can hoist externalities upon defenseless, unorganized, vulnerable citizens or small businesses, instead of internalize them, which what the law would require them to do, they will do that. And if they don't internalize these costs, like pollution and corporate crime, what happens is that they have less incentive in their economic calculus to prevent it. Internalizing diseconomies leads to prevention. If they had to pay, for example, for the damage of auto crashes and injuries, they would have put seat belts and airbags and better brakes and tires years ago faster into cars. But they didn't have to do that until the motor vehicle safety laws were enacted in 1966 in the United States. This strategic planning, this desire for control of unpredictable events, even goes into the area of Wall Street. Wall Street develops predictability and control by using other people's money, recklessly, speculating. Even back in the 1930s, John Keynes, the British economist, John Maynard Keynes, was complaining that Wall Street was moving away from investment and into speculation. Well, he couldn't possibly predict 2008. and what's going on now. Increasingly, aside from venture capital, Wall Street is a casino. Business Week called it a casino. They had a cover story called Casino Capitalism, using pension money, mutual fund money, speculating with it. When they break the boundaries of the law, which they can often decide what will be legislated, and they crash, guess what? I once had a huge rally in front of the New York Stock Exchange, and we had a huge banner, and it says, "Socialism bails out capitalism." When GM recklessly mismanaged its business, even now admitted by retired GM executives, the government in Washington bailed them out, over $35 billion US dollars worth. When Wall Street crashed, unemploying 8 million workers and trillions of dollars of lost pension and mutual funds, they went to Washington for a bailout. Some of it was paid back under the TARP program, but there was enormous trillions of dollars obligated in terms of the taxpayer, and a lot dispensed. So we have a system that has perverse incentives. We have a system where banks are too big to fail. There are big banks too big to fail. There are fewer big banks in the United States now than there was before the crash in 2008. And they are making more profits than ever before. That's not supposed to happen. As conservative syndicated columnist George Will has said repeatedly in his columns that are in 300 newspapers, if a bank is too big to fail, it is too big to exist. That's authentic conservative doctrine. That's not corporatist doctrine. That's conservative doctrine. So if you'll permit me a few preliminaries before I go into what I call the zones of lawlessness that have developed. And mind you, we're talking about some of the most brilliant intellectual achievements in the history of North America, compliments of the giant corporate law firms, so often trained at Harvard, Yale, Chicago, Bolt Hall, Stanford, and Penn, etc. And these are predicates to try to understand this framework of corporate crime that is so embedded in our culture, in its system of control, impunity, and immunity, that we don't really feel it. And I'll exemplify that in a few moments. We don't feel it like a cab driver cheating us. We don't feel it like somebody burglarizing our home when we're away. And it's that lack of anthropomorphic fear that corporate crime utilizes in order to persist and deepen its involvement in our economy. And I know some economists will say, well, this is very costly. Well, it's costly to the victims, but it's not necessarily costly until a crash occurs to the overall economy. Because corporate crime is often translated into greater sales. I mean, if you have batteries of lawyers and accountants, like General Electric has, in order to squeeze out every conceivable tax loophole and tax haven, and give bonuses to the lawyers and accountants, from a system of tax law that General Electric lobbyists helped shape in Congress, you're creating jobs. If people are dying, as they do over 400,000 people in our country from tobacco-related diseases, you're creating a lot of jobs for funeral parlors, nurses, doctors, health insurance agents. That's the grotesque nature of it. That the costs are recycled into sales and profits. But they damage seriously what I call the quality of the economy. And they may increase the overall GDP, but they damage what the economy delivers in terms of proper economic services. For example, if you look at modern cars today, can you see a bumper? The bumper has disappeared in most cars. The mold comes out extruded from the automated auto plants, and there's no bumper that is separate. It juts out. As a result, if you have a 5-mile-an-hour collision, or say a 7-kilometer-mile collision or so, you can pay $2,000 US dollars to repair it. Now, that repair gives business to repair garages. It gives business to people who make replacement parts for cars. But really, do we need an economy that delivers those kinds of services when what we should have is a decent bumper protection so we don't have higher insurance rates and more repair? Now, the quality of the economy is not adequately taught in economics departments. I learned economics at Princeton, and it was fascinating and forgettable mythology. Supply-demand curves. Empirically starved. I once got a letter from Paul Samuelson, who was putting out his 8th edition of his textbook. We were working on his early edition at Princeton. It was the textbook that universities and colleges used. And he said, send me some information on consumer protection. I want to put a few paragraphs in my next edition. What? Don't we remember Adam Smith, who said, the purpose of all production is consumption? Here is a brilliant economist at MIT. And it took him years to figure out that maybe there should be a page or two on consumer protection, otherwise known as enforcing consumer laws and enforcing the health, safety, and economic well-being of the people for whom economies exist. So let me just give a few of these quick predicates. Number one, you cannot have a sense of justice without having a cultivated sense of injustice. Now, it's easy to have a sense of injustice that an elderly person crossing a highway and is hit by a reckless motorcycle rider. You can say that is unjust. That's a one-level factual awareness connecting to a moral standard. But when you're dealing with the complexities of gaming a legal system, as complex as ours with raw power, what happens is, if you don't have a cultivated sense of injustice, you can't have a sense of how to straighten the system out, except just in the general way of saying, I think businesses should be honest. That's not good enough. Just as we don't say, I think hurricanes can be deadly, or tornadoes can be deadly, we don't just stop there. We micro-devolve it into how can it be deadly in terms of water resources, electricity, emergency help, transportation, clogged highways, housing demolitions, and so on. So we have to have a sense of injustice, which means we have to be factually prepared to make the analysis. And I spoke a couple years ago to the incoming class at Harvard Law School, and the first thing I said to them was, you are the best of the brightest, aren't you? All you got to do is ask them. And I said, you know what? You are totally factually unprepared to enter law school. You have no idea how raw power is insinuated to make a mockery of the legal system whose technicalities you are studying so that you can be a cog in a governmental or corporate institutional wheel. And you're not supposed to be a cog. You're going to be officers of the court. You're not supposed to be secondary human beings who don't take your conscience to work and just represent your retainer, your employer. You're supposed to be a primary human being. And you can't go through 3 years of law school without being able to enunciate more than 3 or 4 corporate crime examples. I even showed him a book and left it in the world's largest law library, Getting Steam to Overcome Corporatism. Here's over 100 cases of documented corporate crime. And so you start out and you're totally blasé. What's this, corporate crime? And see what happens to you 3 hours and a half later when you see what the drug companies have done to innocent patients, how they've gouged them mercilessly, how they have sold them unapproved uses to the drug, like Viax being sold by Pfizer. Viax supposed to deal with heart problems. It created heart problems. It produced many, many deaths. How the drug companies are subsidized by the U.S. government. Free research and development. No reasonable price provision. Out of the National Institutes of Health, one drug after another, given under free license to a selected major drug company. How the drug companies get tax credits for doing research. Why should we give them tax credit for doing what they should be doing to make a profit? Research. It's okay. We give them tax credits. How the drug companies still making the most profit over American consumers of any consumers in the world. They can't charge Canadians the level of price that they charge in the U.S., where they were given birth and rose to profits on the back of American workers and taxpayers. They now have outsourced 60% of active materials in our pharmaceuticals and over half of the final drugs to China in order to make more money. And the laboratories in China are not properly supervised by our Food and Drug Administration in Washington. It's hard to get in there. It's hard to get material that's secret. And in one case, 130 and maybe much more people in the States died on the operating table by a contaminated blood thinner called heparin. Just like that. Within hours, they were dead. And it's not labeled. People in the United States now, shall I take this vaccine? Shall I take this blood thinner? Shall I take this painkiller? They don't know where it's made. They don't know what parts of it come from China or elsewhere. This is what happens when you do not have a rule of law to curtail raw power. Second is, and this will, I think, puzzle all of us in criminology. One of your professors has put together a book, you can guess who, on the anniversary, I guess it was the 42nd anniversary of a book called The Crimes of the Powerful. And in that book, there are academics who are praising the scholar. And I just flipped through it, and I looked in the index, because I wondered how they define corporate crime. Because so often, the corporate lobbyists write the criminal code. And when they write the criminal code, they often exclude the criminal penalty for willful and knowing violations that result in serious death, injury, or economic harm to innocent people. I know this firsthand because when I was trying to get the auto safety laws through Congress in 1966, the one battle we lost, we were up against Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, the corporate law firm retained by GM, was the criminal penalty. They excised it from the two laws so that they were able to willfully, knowingly violate in succeeding years safety regulations and only be slapped with a modest civil fine, like the GM ignition switch or the Toyota sudden acceleration or the VW manipulation of software for emissions of nitrogen oxides. So how do you define corporate crime? When you've got a system where there's so many statutes, where there's no criminal penalty, or if there is, it's so modest, it's laughable. In our worker safety law in Washington, catch this, if you kill a wild burro, a wild donkey, in Colorado, it's a maximum 1-year jail sentence. If you engage in intentional acts in a corporation that kill workers, it's a misdemeanor, a maximum 6-month prison term. How do you deal with the most trivial fines imaginable that are not even adjusted for inflation over the last 50 years? You deal with it by elaborating this concept of criminogenic corporate behavior. That is, if you go back to the common law in England, before statutory law codified crimes, they had a definition. It's in Black's dictionary. It's, premeditated behavior that seriously injures innocent people, formulations like that. And if you take that definition, we truly are in a massive, unprecedented, quantifiably unchallenged corporate crime wave in our country's history. Partly it's due to a complex economy. There are more opportunities to cheat, lie, and steal. Partly it's due to the crumbling of enforcement budgets. You wouldn't believe how few lawyers are in the Environmental Crimes Division of our Justice Department. We have major law firms in our country that have 2,000 lawyers, corporate lawyers. The number of lawyers in the Justice Department dealing with environmental crimes, Monsanto, BP, you name it, has fluctuated in the last 30 years between 33 and 77. Hardly a corner in law firms like Covington and Burling or Hale and Dorr, or whatever its new name is, or Cravath Swain, or even larger firms. Now that's not a minor thing. If you have a street crime wave in New York City and you have 100 police, people would say, this is crazy. We have to have more cops on the street crime beat. But we don't have a political movement that says we have to have more national cops on the corporate crime beat. As a result, what the Justice Department does, and what you are now doing in Canada, is you develop a prosecutorial discretion parsimony that says the following. We don't have anywhere near enough prosecutors, investigators, and lawyers to enforce the law. So we have to pick and choose. And there's nothing new about that, except the latest stage. We not only have to pick and choose, when we pick, we engage in deferred prosecution. Because we can't handle a major corporate crime trial. It's too labor intensive for the few lawyers working in government. So what they do is they take these companies, and this is in the last 15, 20 years. They take these companies, and instead of what they did to Eli Lilly 30 years ago or so, Eli Lilly was guilty, and they had to fork over $1.3 billion for promoting unapproved uses of their pharmaceuticals. Now what deferred prosecution does is they sit down around the big table with the government lawyers and the corporate lawyers representing these corporate crooks, and they say, we will concede culpability in return for deferring prosecution, X years, on good behavior under a monitor often chosen by the corporation. that every month monitors their behavior. Well, of course, that's not much of a deterrent. In fact, it's a get-out-of-jail card for a lot of corporate executives. That's an example of how you have to go to the level of criminogenic behavior, the kind of behavior we would condemn our neighbor or a small business on Main Street for doing. The third predicate which we need to look at is the fourth, actually. I mentioned it earlier. Now I'll mention it again. Our nature is such that we fear anthropomorphic crime far more than institutional impersonal crime. Let's face it, there's no one who's exempt from that. You fear people who are muggers, people who are rapists. It's in our DNA. But people who smog a city, which results in hundreds of respiratory disease fatalities and even more illness, the fear just isn't there. Although in some cities in the world now, it's becoming a major issue. It's so thick and suffocating. How do you get around that? It's called a liberal education. It's called readers think and thinkers read. It's called being alert to signals that will be picked up by your mind, if not by your physical sensory apparatus. So if someone is an arsonist and lights a fire in a house on your street and it's heading toward you, you don't have any intellect to know what you have to do. You call the fire department and you run away, or you help rescue people. It's visceral. But corporate crime that exudes carbon monoxide, for example, you can't smell it, see it, or taste it, but it kills you. It has to appeal to your intellect. It has to appeal to how much data we can absorb, how many controlled tests we can read about, how this translates into the law, apropos the old Roman law adage, out of the fact comes the law, how it translates into a political issue at election time, how it translates into law enforcement, how it translates into the professional conscience of members of the bar, how it changes the economics profession so they deal with the dark side of the economy with their intellectual acumen, and other professions as well, like the public health profession. This, of course, relates to this growing debate in our country. Is a corporation a person, or is a corporation a non-person? I don't know what you're talking about in this country, but in our Constitution, the word corporation or company doesn't exist. The preamble is for we the people. It's not we the corporation, it's not we the Congress, it's we the people. And yet, through judicial activism, starting in the 19th century, step by step, artificial entities called corporations began to absorb the same rights as real human beings. We're not talking about employees of corporations or executives. We're talking about the corporate entity itself. And so the first thing it got was equal protection under the laws, under the 14th Amendment, which was really not designed to apply to corporations. 1886, Supreme Court dicta, although some think it was a railroad company lawyer, retired scribe, who put it into the summary. And in the succeeding years, they have adopted, they've had the courts give them every right that the Constitution gives real live human beings, except the right against self-incrimination. In other words, a corporation cannot plead the Fifth Amendment and say, I refuse to testify on myself because I have the right not to incriminate myself. That's the only thing left. The corporation right to remain silent and not speak has been given First Amendment protection. When Dow Chemical challenged the Environmental Protection Agency's airplanes over its complex in Michigan because they wanted to take photos and document illegal pollution, Dow Chemical sued the federal government saying it was violating their Fourth Amendment right against illegal search and seizure. Corporation as a person means we can never have equal justice under the law between you, me, and General Motors or ExxonMobil or Pfizer or Imperial Chemical or whatever. Because once the corporations get equal justice under the law, they then, through their power, their money, their perpetuity, etc., can have immunities and privileges that none of us can have, even if we're a billionaire human being. Can you create your own parent? I see nobody's raising their hands. Corporations do it all the time. It's called holding companies. Can you decide to create 300 children around the world and have them do bad things so they can hold you insulated from headquarters at home? That's happened. They're called subsidiaries. Can you simply go bankrupt and have the company that is in bankruptcy pay you retention salaries and bonuses because you have too much relevant information during the bankruptcy process? Wouldn't that be nice if individuals could go bankrupt and have that sort of help? Or escape your labor union contracts or your tort liability exposure, even if the case is in court? It's rubbed out, as it was in the GM bailout. There's no contest. The more corporations develop supremacies over individual human beings, the more we lose our freedoms, the more we lose our future, the more we lose control over our children. Look at Facebook and Google. Look how they're getting into the kids, even with fine print contracts. The more we lose control in every conceivable manner of a humane and democratic society. Markets make good servants, but very bad masters. Corporations have to be our servants. They are now our masters. And they are the paymasters of our elected officials. Here in Canada, and Duff Conacher's here. How many of you heard Duff Conacher? Democracy Watch? Anybody hear of Democracy Watch? Go to democracywatch.ca, and you will see how Canada is becoming more like the U.S. The Liberal government has changed the federal criminal code, so you're going to see deferred prosecution more frequently. There are efforts to have parliamentary House hearings on conflicts of interest, and the Liberal government is not very excited about plugging the loopholes. You have other proposals in the Parliament to strengthen the corporate criminal law. If they don't have the support of the Liberal government, they're not going anywhere. Fortunately, you have an easier way to get things done in a parliamentary system. You don't have filibusters and all the other stuff, divided government. So you have petitions now of thousands of consumers and consumer groups asking the relevant agencies and ministries to start a financial consumer action group with full-time staff and to start a group dealing with financial services that represent are controlled by financial institution customers, the consumers. You have a House hearing, I guess, coming up on conflicts of interest. That's full of loopholes. You can actually have government officials with investments in private business, and they can make decisions affecting those private businesses. Your Liberal government is not enthusiastic about strengthening that either. So if you want to know where Canada is going, unfortunately, just look at where America has already been. Canadian independence has always been a crisis issue with the giant 800-pound gorilla to the south. But with globalization and all the rest of it, you have to fight much harder in order to preserve your own self-determination. Now, let me give a little taxonomy here on how corporate crime operates. First of all, corporate violations are not exceptions. They are the norm. So when you go to law school and they show you successful prosecutions against corporations, don't think that that legitimizes the rest of the legal system. Like, hey, that's the rule of law. Because the enforcement of the law against corporations is an infinitesimal 1% or less of the range of violations. That's why our regulatory agencies don't have compliance reports every year. It's too embarrassing. If the EPA and the Job Safety and the Food and Drug Administration and so on, they had compliance reports, they would have to collect data from corporate crime. They would have to show that a majority of water pollution permits are violated and are not enforced. That's embarrassing to the law enforcement people, who are often looking for jobs, by the way, after they leave government, in the very corporations that they were responsible holding accountable. It's what we call the Wall Street, Washington merry-go-round. Now, to give an example of this is going to shock you by its very quantity. Some of you may know what the GDP of Canada is. And some of you may know how much you spend on health care, which is about 10% of your GDP. We spend 18%, and we have 30 million people not covered, millions partially covered, people dying as a result, and we spend $9,500 per capita. You spend about $4,500 per capita, and you cover everyone. Now, Malcolm Sparrow, who's an applied mathematician at Harvard, he's a consultant to various agencies. He's a very, very smart and accurate person. And he is the expert on billing fraud in the healthcare industry. That's physicians, health insurance companies, hospitals, drug companies, you name it. His most conservative estimate is that out of the $3.5 trillion we're going to spend in the United States this year for health care, $350 billion is drained away because of, quote, computerized billing, fraud, and abuse. That's $350 billion. Not more than $3 billion of that is recovered by law enforcement. You're talking about less than 1%. That's what we mean when we talk about a corporate crime wave. If you don't trust Malcolm Sparrow, the prestigious Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress, that's the auditing arm, it's never been accused of any scandals or corruption. In 1992, put the ratio at 10%. 10% of every dollar spent is defrauded by computerized billing, fraud, and abuse. Never mind malpractice. Let's get to malpractice. Let's get to criminal negligence in hospitals. A recent Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine report, May 2016, by physicians, estimated in their final report that the smallest number that they could come up with was that every week in the United States of America, land of the free, home of the brave, 5,000 people die every week due to preventable problems in hospitals, not clinics or doctor offices, just hospitals. We're talking about hospital-induced infections, talking about incompetence, malpractice, we're talking about inattentiveness, all the things that should be preventable. Now, where's the law enforcement there? The medical examiner offices are a joke in the 50 states. They almost never suspend a physician license. They hardly have a staff to investigate anything. And if they do, it's usually physician theft rather than theft of life or limb. The federal government isn't even on the ball. They don't really have an agency that deals with it. Now, 9/11 took 3,100 lives. Once, fortunately, only once. Every week, 5,000 deaths, and many more thousand preventable injuries and illnesses. I've hardly spoken to anyone in the country that doesn't have a story about them, a relative, or a friend picking up an infection in a hospital. And now hospitals are beginning to reduce their infections by telling nurses and doctors to more frequently wash their hands. That's a high-tech solution. Now, when you have that problem year after year, you know you don't have a rule of law. You know you don't have an enforcement program. You know you don't have external pressure to induce internal accountabilities. You know the law of torts is not representing more than a tiny, tiny fraction of next of kin or victims. Take the tobacco industry. Why is it you can legally sell tobacco in North America and make big profit, although you now have to have warnings, and you can't sell heroin or cocaine? What is the difference? Nicotine is very addictive. What's the difference? It used to be legal to sell cocaine in the U.S. in the late 19th century. That's where the word Coca-Cola came from. Until the opiate epidemic, street drugs killed about 7,000 to 8,000 people a year in the U.S., 420,000 tobacco-related deaths. What is the cultural distinction here? What is the medical distinction here? They're both addictive. They're both lucrative. One is the underworld, and the other is the overworld, whining and dining members of Congress, and whose executives get invited to White House dinners. And they've known again and again, even though they covered it up for years, that it causes lung disease and many other cardiovascular and other ailments. And instead of owning up to it, they passed out free cigarettes a half a block away from middle and high schools to give to students. So they hook them early for a lifetime of slow motion death. So there's a cultural aspect to corporate crime, isn't there? Why is it? Why is it that in our styles of violence, the greatest attention and the greatest budgets, especially for departments of criminology, are street crime, not corporate crime? Because corporate crime emanates from powerful interests that neglect, rationalize, obfuscate, or profit. That's the difference. And don't anybody think that aspects of corporate crime and impoverishment and landlord crimes, etc., do not affect street crime. They have more than a few interlinks. Now, our time is short, and we want to have a roundtable and discussion, but I want to leave you with a couple additional points. State-sponsored terrorism is the greatest form of terrorism in the world. We killed far more civilians, men, women, and children in Iraq than all of Al-Qaeda and ISIS have killed in their brutality. And that's just Iraq. Never mind Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, Somalia, Yemen, through the proxy war there, and so on. State-sponsored terrorism headquarters is the White House of the government of the United States of America. Starting before Clinton and going forward to Bush and Obama and now Trump, the presidents have become prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, and cover-upper. They violate federal statutes. They violate our constitutional accord that only Congress declare war. They violate international treaties like the Geneva Conventions. And they kill and maim and slaughter, violating national sovereignties. The body of international law and its professors is as dead as any category of law in the world today. Drones go anywhere. Special forces of the U.S. last year went into 140 countries. We have bases in over 150 countries. Some of it is consensual, some of it is secretive and illegal. We have a system of law in our government that gives us the following: secret wars, secret evidence, secret prison, secret appropriations, secret witnesses. This is an open democracy. We have the Libyan war. It was not declared. It was not authorized for money. It was not appropriated by Congress for money. It was Hillary's war against the opposition of the Secretary of Defense, who was overruled by Obama. And now that whole area of the world is in violent chaos. 7 African countries. A totally criminal war of aggression, clearly violating the UN Charter, to which the U.S. is an early signatory. What do we do about it? The law schools are dead in the water. There are no protests. The law reviews don't like to write about it. The law schools are not our first responders. The law profession is not our first responders. Who is going to be our first responders but an aroused citizenry? Where it all comes from. That's where all justice comes from. The civic community or the civil society. I'll end on this note. When raw power breaks through the boundaries of systems of law and keeps doing it more aggressively with greater range in time and space and keeps getting away with it, it will destroy itself. That's the lesson of history. All empires destroy themselves. All empires devour themselves. And the U.S. empire is no exception. All corporate power will destroy itself. That's why the communists gained so much sway decades ago. And if corporations keep thinking that Wall Street can get away with this and that, with its reckless speculation, conflicts of interest, because Washington will always bail it out. There's a limit to socialism bailing out capitalism, corporate capitalism, before we have a different type of political economy installed. And maybe that's a message that will resonate in the corporate boardrooms, and maybe these corporate boardrooms will start listening to some of the enlightened corporate executives that are sounding the alarms. Believe it or not, the head of BlackRock put out a speech a year ago sounding the alarm. Watch out, he said in convenient, polite language. you're pushing your luck. You're pushing the envelope. That's Lawrence Fink. So I'll leave you with this, because I believe that those of you who want to go further on this, you have a wonderful book called Canada After Harper. This came out before Harper lost. It's got 21 experts in almost every area of Canada's political economy and constitutional rights, and it's still very relevant. And I'll leave that in the library. And the book that we're going to sign, called To the Ramparts, shows that everything didn't start with Trump here. Trump was preceded by all kinds of Trumpian conditions that our country allowed to happen, whether it was Clinton's philandering and abuse of women, and he got away with it, whether it was Bush and Obama's criminal wars of aggression, whether it was the coddling of Wall Street and allowing them to be reckless with other people's money, right down to absurd capital ratios. These had precedents way, way before Trump. False facts. What do you think Madison Avenue is all about? Deceptive advertising didn't start with Donald Trump. A media that goes for titillation and sensationalism and triviality and deliberately does not give voice to the concerns of people for their children and grandchildren. That didn't start with Donald Trump. He just gave it a hard edge. He gave it profanity. He got rid of the silk tongue. He got rid of the smooth flattery that his predecessors were engaged in. If there's ever a last chapter of the calamity of our civilizations, it will not be written by the oppressors. It will not be written by the corporate supremacists. It will be written by us who allowed it to happen. By us, especially the informed bystanders. Nothing is more destructive of a sane, progressive, humane society than millions of informed bystanders. People who know better, but people who have all kinds of ways to excuse themselves from engaging in civic commitment, from the ridings, from the municipalities, all the way up to the national and international institutions. If you'd like 7 minutes of agitation every week, you can subscribe to my column by going to nader.org for further elaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Nader, for such an insightful presentation with so many points really to even start debate on. Just may I say before we invite our panel up, your counsel to young lawyers at Harvard University that you can't contribute to an improved system of justice without a carefully cultivated sense of injustice, I think rings true for criminology as well. Criminology as something that studies what you call raw power and its connection to the system cannot be limited to the academy all on its own, or it would be a cog in a machine. Thank you for being with us this evening and joining us on the panel. At this time, I'd like to invite two of our professors up to join the panel, Stephen Biddle and Maritza Felicis Luna. Professor Stephen Biddle is an associate professor with us. He came to us through criminology degrees at Simon Fraser in British Columbia and a PhD in sociology from Queen's and Kingston. He spent the better part of a decade with the Federal Civil Service, first in the Department of Justice, the Law Commission of Canada, and the Security and Intelligence Review Committee. He's now one of our leading scholars in the area of crimes of the powerful, and in particular, he's way out ahead in the more specific domain of white-collar crime or corporate crime. His newest book is called Revisiting Crimes of the Powerful, Marxism, Crime, and Deviance, co-edited with Laureen Schneider, Steve Toombs, and David White. And true to the academic mold, of course, Steve is keenest to move on from the past and mention his forthcoming work with others. He'll be the editor of an upcoming special issue of the journal Critical Criminology, which will have a series of articles on crimes of the powerful focused in the context of Canada. Professor Maritza Felices Luna has come to us from Peru, beginning her study of criminology at the University of Montreal, where she conducted her master's and PhD research on armed internal conflict within nation states. Her research and teaching areas of interest are political violence, armed conflict, qualitative methodology, and ethics in research. She has and continues to travel all over the planet investigating these themes, notably running larger research projects in Peru, Northern Ireland, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In addition to her high-paced academic publication schedule, Maritza is currently researching aesthetics in political violence by looking at the artistic productions of armed groups, along with fictional representations of political violence in books, films, and graphic novels. So for our panel this evening, we're going to begin. I'm going to pose a question to each of our professors, which will give them a chance to react a little bit to Mr. Nader's presentation. Mr. Nader may have something to add to what they say, and then we'll turn it over to questions which I'll explain from the audience in a little while. Donc en premier, Maritza va s'exprimer en français pour nous. Donc j'aimerais vous demander, Maritza, de quelle manière dirais-tu que, dans le contexte politique actuel, le mythe de l'état de droit produit et dissimule la criminalité étatique, this type of system of law that Mr. Nader has described, how does it, in some senses, promote and hide state crime from our view?
Merci Michael et bonne soirée à tous, à toutes et à tous. Je commence avec un avertissement. Mes remarques seront grossières. Elles manqueront de nuances, de finesses et d'arguments pour les soutenir. Mon objectif n'est pas de vous convaincre de quoi que ce soit, mais simplement d'alimenter la discussion lancée par M. Nader. Deuxième avertissement, mes remarques portent sur la criminalité étatique commise au nom de la sécurité nationale. Je parle des crimes commis par des agents de l'État, au nom de l'État, afin de protéger et d'avancer les intérêts économiques et politiques de celui-ci. Donc mon intervention se structure autour de trois remarques. Premièrement, je ne considère pas que le contexte politique actuel joue un rôle dans la criminalité étatique. En fait, quelle que soit la forme de gouvernement en place, le contexte politique se caractérise toujours par un va-et-vient, par un jeu de force constant entre des tendances plus autoritaires ou populistes et des tendances plus démocratiques. Ainsi, les États ont recours à la criminalité étatique aussi bien en période démocratique qu'en période populiste ou autoritaire. La différence semblerait être dans la manière dont les États gèrent leur image suite à la révélation de ces crimes. Ainsi, le contexte nous permet de comprendre la réaction de l'État face à sa propre criminalité, mais il ne nous permet pas de comprendre la commission de ces crimes. Ce qui m'amène à ma deuxième remarque. L'État de droit permet en partie d'expliquer la criminalité étatique de deux manières. Premièrement, l'État de droit donne au souverain le pouvoir, le droit, la responsabilité de déterminer le moment d'exception, le moment où l'État de droit et toutes ses garanties doivent être suspendus afin d'assurer la survie de l'État. L'État de droit permet à l'État de contrevenir les lois nationales et internationales en toute légalité, puisqu'en décrétant l'état d'exception, l'État n'est plus légalement contraint à respecter la loi. Deuxièmement, lorsque l'État ne déclare pas un état d'exception, l'État de droit lui permet d'adopter des lois qui autorisent des actes qui autrement seraient proscrits par la loi, d'interpréter des lois nationales ou internationales de manière à rendre légal des actes criminels, par exemple la torture, en disant que ce n'est pas vraiment c'est ce qui s'est passé, ou encore d'octroyer des amnisties ou des pardons aux personnes ayant enfreint la loi. Autrement dit, l'état de droit permet qu'en toute légalité, des actes criminels ne soient pas reconnus en tant que crimes et que les acteurs de ces crimes n'aient aucune responsabilité criminelle. Troisième et dernière remarque, en tant que principe d'organisation sociale, l'état de droit est producteur de vulnérabilités et de précarité. L'état de droit assigne au droit le rôle d'établir les règles du jeu. Et pour légitimer ces règles, le droit mobilise une rhétorique qui fait appel à des principes philosophiques ou moraux dits universels. Cette rhétorique a été critiquée par des arguments qui démontrent que les lois véhiculent des valeurs, des modes de vie et des préoccupations qui ne sont pas universels, car les lois sont produites par des institutions composées d'individus qui, eux, sont porteurs d'intérêts, des visions partiales et partielles du monde. Le principe d'égalité et d'équité dans l'application de la loi est souvent utilisé pour légitimer les règles imposées par le droit. Sans m'attarder sur les nombreuses critiques d'une telle affirmation, je tiens plutôt à souligner que l'adage « nul est au-dessus de la loi » est foncièrement faux. L'état des droits délègue au droit le pouvoir de déterminer qui est inclus dans la loi et donc qui existe aux yeux de la loi et qui n'est pas inclus dans la loi et par conséquent qui n'existe pas aux yeux de la loi. En reconnaissant l'existence de certains individus en tant que personnes légales sujets des droits et en déniant à d'autres acteurs ces statuts, le droit détermine qui fait partie du corps social en tant que sujet et qui en fait partie en tant qu'objet. Ceux qui ne sont pas reconnus en tant que sujets de droit vivent une mort civile. La vulnérabilité et précarité accrue qui en résultent réduit significativement leur qualité de vie et leur probabilité de survie. Adil Sharkawi, Hassan Almrey, Mohamed Marjoub, Mahmoud Jabala, Mohamed Harkat, Dipan Butlakoti, Maher Arar ne sont que quelques-unes des personnes ayant subi une mort civile au Canada. C'est cette légalité qui donne une aura de légitimité et de moralité à la criminalité étatique et qui, par ce fait même, facilite notre propre aveuglement face aux souffrances et aux injustices que la loi produit. Si l'on veut rendre nos sociétés plus justes, il me paraît nécessaire de rompre avec le mythe que l'état des droits est juste, que l'état des droits est garant de justice et que l'état des droits est la meilleure voie vers la justice. Merci.
Merci, Maritza. I think that points around crimes of the powerful that direct themselves through the state obviously raise a number of issues on how laws are directly manipulated by state governments, often in the name of justice, to commit direct acts of violence on their own citizens and those that they would prefer to define as other, as you were saying. So thank you for those insights. Professor Biddle, Steve, I'd like to ask you a very similar question, but from your perspective on corporate crime as opposed to state crime. How does this myth of the rule of law help obscure or produce corporate crime? And perhaps you could relate what Mr. Nader has said to the criminological context in Canada, first and foremost.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to do what Michael's used to me doing, and I'm just kind of going to ignore his question and say what I want to say. But first, I want to say, for me, what an honor it is to be on the stage with Mr. Nader. And I'm going to try to keep my remarks short because, like everybody, I'd rather hear from him than hear from me. But I'm about to also bite the hand that feeds me in the sense that criminology, I'm very fortunate to work in a department that has very strong senses of injustice and is very attuned to questions of power. But historically, I say criminology generally, and academia generally, has not done a great job at casting its lens or its gaze up the social hierarchy. Criminology has been founded on principles of looking down the social hierarchy at the most marginalized peoples in the world. And I think what Mr. Nader's talk has reinforced today is that some of the real true harms that exist in society are at the top end of the social hierarchy. And that's where we need to be asking these kinds of questions around accountability. So not to ignore Michael totally on this, I think this does bring us back to questions around the rule of law. And to overstate the case slightly, but to make the point that I think in a capitalist society, the rule of law is largely a myth. It's a myth that is used to reinforce an imaginary social order. Law, in many respects, is out there for us to believe that we're all subject to the rule of law, that we are all somehow equal when it comes to the rule of law. But quite clearly, what we've heard tonight from Mr. Nader is that we are in the midst of a massive corporate crime wave, of unprecedented scale, really. And yet there is barely any accountability on this. And I think just to kind of bring things home slightly, right, because there's a tendency for us in Canada to think that things aren't quite as bad as they are in the United States. And again, Mr. Nader has alluded to the fact that things have started to change here in ways that reflect some of the things that have already happened in the United States and around the abuse of power. Right? You know, Canada, particularly with the election of Trump, is often held up as one of the last liberal democratic nations of the world, right? It's the bastion where things of possibility are still out there. Our Prime Minister was on the cover of Rolling Stone. Americans are asking why we can't have him as our president. But behind all of that, I think behind that shiny veneer, if you will, I think there are some troubling realities to the way that the rule of law also works here in Canada and also helps produce corporate impunity for the many harms and crimes that corporations commit. And I'm going to just give a couple of examples that just touch on this, and one that's close, near and dear to my heart in my own research. And that is, if everybody is old enough here to remember in 1992 at the Westray mine when 26 workers were killed in an underground explosion, that was caused by dangerous and illegal working conditions. Nobody was held to account for that. Right? And part of that has to do with the way that our law is actually structured. And Mr. Nader talked about the fact that our law is actually better suited to dealing with individual forms of one-on-one violence, of dealing with that kind of violence that exists, as we're told, is the most serious violence in our society at the lower end of the social spectrum. When in fact, the kinds of crimes that happen in corporations don't fit that mold very well. So when it comes time for law to do its work, to try to find an accountable individual, it's not so easy to do when you're talking about organizational violence. And so part of what he's doing here is also talking about the inherent criminogenic tendency of this corporation, what I want to get to in a second. But back to the Westray story, right? So that was such an abuse of power and such a blatant lack of accountability that eventually, and I say eventually because the government took 10 years to get around to changing our criminal laws to introduce corporate criminal liability legislation to try to hold corporations accountable for the exact kind of scenarios that the Westray disaster exemplified. And it's hard for us to imagine, right, that a state would take so long to introduce new laws, 10 years in the making, after such a violent, traditional kind of street crime, right? They would act almost immediately and would be propelled to do so through political processes. But long after that happened, the new laws were finally introduced, right? We do have, in the criminal code, legislation that holds corporations accountable when negligence is involved and a worker or a member of the public dies as a result. That law has now been on the books since about 2004. I think that maybe we have around a handful, 4, 5, 6 convictions under that legislation. And that's despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of workers have died annually in the intervening years. And so part of that, again, is around this whole structure of law, that it's not well attuned to dealing with organizational violence. But there's one point that I want to hit on here that, again, I think really is something that we need to also stress when talking about these things globally, but in the Canadian context. That the law creates a situation that allows the corporation to be inherently criminogenic. And Mr. Nader alluded to the fact that the corporation is its own person in law, right? And so on the face of that, you would think, okay, if you're going to claim to be a person in law, then when it comes time for you to be held responsible for you as a person having done something, we should probably be able to hold you to account for that. But here's the real trick of that, right? Is that as soon as we try to pin responsibility on something, those who own and control corporations benefit from limited liability. They can say, as Harry Glassbeak, many of you know as a legal scholar here in Canada who makes this point, right? They can say, it wasn't us that did it, it was our friend the corporation. We can't hold a corporation to account the way that we hold individuals to account. And so it becomes really difficult to use the law in order to hold corporations accountable. It's not impossible, But it's an indication, and the Canadian example of the Westray laws, it's now called, not being enforced is another indication of how law actually helps reinforce and reproduce the inequalities that exist because of corporations. There are other examples that we could talk about as well, right? We now have deferred prosecution agreements. That was quietly tabled by the Liberal government without much fanfare, right? And the mere fact that there hasn't been lots of questions raised to that, I think really strikes home the fact that we now live in a world, even in the Canadian context, where it's really hard for us to envision a world without corporations. That we've gone so far down this path of what many have called the neoliberal turn, that that privatization, that states being involved in increasingly symbiotic relationships with corporations, that makes it inherently difficult for states to turn around and discipline the very organization that helped catapult to such prominence. And I think deferred prosecution agreements are an example of that we see in the Canadian context. We could also talk about the extractive industry in Canada and some of the contradictory positions that the state has been in relation to some of the claims against Canadian mining, oil and gas industries operating abroad, and on and on and on. I think the one thing that I want to leave us with before maybe we open it up for further conversation on this exact point is that Canada is not immune to many of these conversations around the fact that we are faced with profound abuses of corporate power. And despite the fact that there are important differences between Canada and the United States, I think successive governments at the federal level and the provincial level indicate just how prominent corporate think is in our world, right? We have now, as I said, corporations and states live in this increasingly symbiotic relationship, right? Corporations are both inside and outside of the state. And that makes it really difficult when it comes time to holding corporations to account. But I think what needs to be had is a conversation about this legal structure of the corporation that provides limited liability to those who essentially own and control a corporation, but really don't have to take any responsibility for when things go wrong. They can turn to this legal fiction called the corporation and turn responsibility in that respect. So I take Mr. Nader's call that we have to have these open conversations about the status of corporations in modern society and the role of the state in holding up the rule of law that it purports to be so sacrosanct with. And that's where I'll leave it on this point, that we can't forget that the state is still a democratically elected state, and they are one of the few countervailing forces that we have in society that can hold corporations to account. And it's up to us through these conversations about the inherent harms that appear to be unfolding within the corporate world, that we can ask and force our governments to better account for the abuse of power in all its disguises. So I'll leave it at that for now, thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Wonderful.
Can I comment on that? You see, what's interesting here is very interesting. Unfortunately, I don't understand French. Just take it personally for a moment. If you're a shareholder in a corporation, you have limited liability. Because the old laws there are other reasons, but the old law wanted to encourage you to invest without losing your home if the company went kaput. You just lost what you invested. But if you look at the last 100 years, the trajectory of corporate power is not only limited liability for its investors, mutual funds, pension funds, it's limited liability for the corporation. That's what workers' compensation is. That's what the Price-Anderson Act in the U.S. is, limited liability in case of a nuclear meltdown. The books are full of immunities. So they're moving from limited liability of individual shareholders to a limited liability, de facto and de jure, of the corporation itself. Now here's one way they do it. We all sign these fine print contracts. Is there anybody here who hasn't signed a fine print contract? Insurance, hospital, auto dealer, payday loan, you name it. Everybody. And we click on. We don't even see the contract. Now, freedom of contract and freedom of tort law utilization are the two great private freedoms in our country from England. We got from England. And they're being destroyed. In the U.S., they're curtailing access to the courts if you're wrongfully injured. It's called tort reform. And they're doing it in part by fine print contracts that require you to go to compulsory arbitration and not use your constitutional rights to have your day in court in a trial by jury, which is supposed to be authorized by the 7th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So you have contract law, one-sided contract law, cannibalizing the law of torts, number one. This is what has led Peggy Radin. Margaret Radin wrote this great book. She's a professor of law at the University of Michigan, but she teaches a course now at University of Toronto Law School called Boilerplate. And she finally concluded that these fine print contracts themselves should be seen as torts. Themselves, they are wrongful injuries. Now, just think how personal this is. When you sign a contract, you're supposed to be able to negotiate it. But now they say you have like 50, 100 pages, fine print, you can't even see it often, full of obscure terminology. And the minute you sign, you're held to all the provisions, including unilateral modification. There's nothing, you can't have a contract with unilateral modification. It's the meeting of the minds. Compulsory arbitration, waiver of liability, waiver of trial by jury in our country. So basically what they're doing is they're sanctioning criminogenic behavior that they wouldn't get away with if they couldn't say, oh, you signed on the dotted line. Now I'll give you an example. Delta Airlines charges you $200 if you change a reservation. Southwest Airlines charges nothing. Now, if you say, did I agree to that? If you say to Delta, I never agreed to that. That's a lot of money for pushing a couple of computer buttons. Delta will say, oh, yes, you did. It's in the tariff. But you didn't give me the contract. Oh, yes, by buying the ticket, you signed the contract, which could be hundreds of pages, filed with the government Ministry of Transportation or the FAA. And so, what if there was no fine print contract? What if there was no contractual tort? But somehow Delta had control over $1,000 of your money, and you switched the reservation, and they deducted $200. That would be theft. So what they're rationalizing, that's how they nullify their criminogenic behavior. They use so many sophisticated ways of doing it that we don't learn about in high school. We don't learn about in college. We started an American Museum of Tort Law in Connecticut, the first law museum in the world. What does that tell you about the law profession? Only one law museum. And teachers come in with the students, and the teachers are transformed by the exhibits and graphics and so on. The law of wrongful injury. Somebody injures you wrongfully, you sue the perpetrator. Whether it's a street crime, sexual harasser, a product defect, or whatever. And the teachers would say at the end, you know, we didn't even know what tort law it was. Teachers. So in our country, the judges will solemnly pronounce that ignorance of the law is no excuse. You are deemed to know the law. And we don't teach the law, except in law school. Now here, the editor of the Corporate Crime Reporter, Russell Mokhiber, is here, and he's interviewed some of the people here in the Department of Criminology. He's put it out for 30 years, and he put out a book, Corporate Crime and Violence. And he tells me he cannot keep up with the sophistic gaming of the system. He broke the story early on deferred prosecution because it was secret. I mean, even enforcement of the law is secret. There was a Sara Lee food company that had listeriosis, Listeria, and it killed like 28, 30 people. And they were fined $200,000. And the government had a joint press conference announcing the settlement. 200, 300, 400,000 bucks for killing about 30 people. If that was done with a street crime, you have Parkland High School in Florida. Massive coverage, massive remorse, massive anger, massive rallies in Washington. So we have a Frankenstein in our midst here, which if it isn't subjected to boundaries, moral boundaries, enlightened business boundaries as a countercheck, law boundaries, shareholder power boundaries, regulatory boundaries, it will be what Justice Louis Brandeis said in a Supreme Court opinion in the 1930s. We're creating Frankensteins in our midst. And when you deal with artificial intelligence coming, when you deal with robots coming, Elon Musk warning us, Stephen Hawking warning us, out of our control, but they're controlled by corporations. With automated jobs, nanotechnology, biotech, no legal and ethical frameworks for these technologies. Literally, no legal or ethical frameworks. They've blocked regulation. And these are the arms of impersonal, commercially driven, amoral at best, corporate entities that have one yardstick of success: profits and corporate bonuses and compensation. They're even taking the profits and engaging in trillions of dollars of stock buybacks instead of investing, instead of giving workers higher salaries, instead of shoring up pension funds, instead of doing research and development. What are they doing? They're buying back their stock to meet the metrics for executive compensation at a time when the stock is at a peak. It's one thing if you buy your own stock at a low. Now, there's no Marxist that ever dreamed in the 19th century that corporations in the United States would spend $7 trillion from 2005 to 2009 on stock buybacks and not invest the money in all the ways that our country needs. That's the extent to which, and the SEC does nothing. And the shareholders, it's their money, isn't it? They have no say, no opinion, no approval right. Apple just announced a year ago a $100 billion stock buyback. Tim Cook and one other guy at the top made the decision. Vanguard had no role. Fidelity had no role. BlackRock had no role. University endowments had no role. It's totally out of control. It's not the executive's money. They could have given it in dividends and increased consumption power. Instead, they decided to divert $7 trillion. Just let that sink in. Think what that could have done for our country. And Canada is moving in that direction. And Europe is moving in that direction. They're nowhere near as bad as the U.S. But the trend is mimicking the U.S. model of giant corporate global capitalism. And that model is destroying the safety net, directly and indirectly. The head of Walmart is making $12,000 an hour on the average, 8 hours a day. $12,000. There's 1 million Walmart workers who make less than $20,000 an hour a year. So by 11 o'clock on January 2nd, this man is making more than a Walmart worker makes an entire year. They call that inequality. I call that runaway exploitation. That's why people like Costco, the head of Costco, I had a conversation with him years ago, and I said, why are you paying $11.50 an hour when the average for 1 million Walmart workers is $7.50? You're a competitor. And he said, "You're asking me that question? You don't know the answer to that question?" I said, "Tell me." This is Senegal. He said, "Number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, they're going to spend some of that money in Costco. Number three, I have less turnover, employee turnover, than Walmart does." I said, I asked Walmart officials how they respond to your $11.50 an hour. Why don't they pay $11.50 an hour? Costco pays more now. So does Walmart. And the Walmart officials said, "That's because we have a different business model." And the CEO replied with an unprintable vituperative. A different business model. Nonsense. It's exploitation. In the U.S., they have a fake unemployment rate. If you are employed 21 hours a week, you're employed. 25 hours a week, you're employed. How do you make a living on 21 hours? Number two, if you stop looking for a job because you can't get it for 6 months looking, you drop out of the market, you're not considered unemployed. You see the way they fake the yardsticks? Whoever controls the yardsticks for economic progress controls the agenda, controls the media reporting of it. When they talk about corporate profits at an all-time high, stock market all-time high, unemployment at a low, they don't talk about children poverty at a record. They don't talk about homelessness at a record. They don't talk about occupational disease and injury, 58,000 deaths worker-related a year in the U.S. There are 15,000 homicides, street and domestic violence homicide in the U.S. There are 65,000 deaths from air pollution, EPA figures. 58,000 deaths from worker diseases. Today, this year, because of Obamacare, there are only 35,000 deaths because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. You see how the culture freezes out the massive form of violence. If you say, where is the greatest form of violence and fraud in America today, it is not street crime, bad as it is. It's hands down corporate crime. If you say, where's the greatest welfare system in the United States, it is not welfare for the poor. It's corporate bailouts. They go on when there's not publicity every day, and they go on when there's a publicized crash like Wall Street. Wells Fargo is a corporate criminal, premeditated. They created millions of false credit card accounts and pressured their employees and gave them penalties or quota or bonuses. And they created over 1 million fake auto insurance accounts without even telling their depositors. And there still is not a criminal prosecution. There's a civil fine of over $1 billion. There are private suits, but nothing compared to what it got away with. Now, what human being would get away with something like that? It's too big to fail. It's too big to be prosecuted. But it's embedded in our culture, so we don't feel it. The politicians don't run against it. And it has a horrendous cost on people. When you look at landlord violations in our country, they're homicidal. They're homicidal. The kids are dying. Rats, infestations, asthma, because they're not required to have habitable residences. They bribe the inspectors. It's rampant. And, you don't have to believe any figures but one. When you have a tiny number of law enforcers, like you have too few prosecutions here in Canada, for a relatively good criminal code that was passed, 15 years ago or something? A corporate criminal code. But if you don't have any prosecutors, it's just a piece of paper. That's all it is.
Perhaps, Mr. Nader, we have only a few moments until we must conclude and move on to a book signing that Mr. Nader has kindly agreed to do in the rotunda at the front of the building here. Pardon me? At the back of the building, rather. I've been turned around in my mind. If I may just perhaps conclude by asking you one question, Mr. Nader. In your book, To the Ramparts, where you make many recommendations for a kind of intellectual and political call to arms for major political and justice change, what can universities most usefully contribute to the rampart call that you make? What would you like to see for university collaboration?
Well, I really like that question because, by the way, we shouldn't let off the accounting firms who allowed inflated profits and secret debt to be downloaded that led to the Wall Street. We shouldn't allow the corporate firms. These are aiders and abettors of corporate crime. They're the brain trust. But you asked this question. There's a young man in the audience. His name is Muhammad Akbar, and he wants to expand the PERG movement that is at universities in 5 provinces, I think, from Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario. That's where the students have a checkoff, and they hire their own full-time staff to make Ontario a better place, environment, consumer protection. He wants to do it for your technical institutes. We call them community colleges. And there are hundreds of thousands of students in Canada in these technical institutes, and he wants to start these student-citizen action groups. So they learn citizen skills, they learn citizen advocacy, and they work with the university PERGs. The PERGs are public interest research groups, and like OPERG is Ontario PERG. And I think there's one in Quebec, and there's one at Simon Fraser or BC, University of British Columbia. And that's the way you start the next generation. First of all, they start writing interesting research papers because they're right in the fray of an abuse in their community. And second, they learn civic skills. We have students learning computer skills. We have students learning to be computer literate, but they're not civic literate. They're not civically literate, which is far more important. And so he wants help. And anybody who is interested in this, Muhammad, where are you? He's right here. He's working at Carleton University. He's spent a lot of volunteer time. He's talked to all kinds of people, teachers and students. It's just a checkoff system. And by that, I mean we have to have facilities, just the way corporations have facilities, that make it easier for people to band together as insurance customers, bank customers, car owners, in nonprofit consumer advocacy groups that strengthen the civil society from which all justice emanates. And if you have a weak civil society, the commercialism takes over. The corporate politicians take over. So that's one thing. The universities and colleges in North America do not have an active citizen community. The faculty can organize. They can have the same checkoff system and organize their own to defend not their guild rights, that's for the unions, but to defend the whole concept of knowledge to action, the whole concept of what an ancient Chinese philosopher once said, to know and not to do is not to know. To know and not to do is not to know. There's a lot of wisdom, even though it's an exaggeration, in that pithy little phrase from the 14th century Ming Dynasty, how much we still have to learn from the ancients. And you couple that with Marcus Cicero, the great Roman orator, lawyer from 2,000 years ago. He defined freedom in the best way I've ever heard. Just think of that. Connect it to know and not to do is not to know. Freedom, Marcus Cicero said, is participation in power. Freedom is participation. And for that, you not only need rights and remedies and consumer power and all the rest, and disclosure and competition. You need facilities to make it easy for people to band together and strengthen the fibers and roots of civic power. I challenge people in the States. I say, give me one social justice movement in the history of the United States that did not start with two people having a conversation, two ordinary people having a conversation, and then 100, and then 1,000, and then it gets translated into the electoral and the governing arenas and the corporate marketplace. And it never takes more than 1% of the people to have civic clubs or parliamentary watchdog groups or congressional watchdog groups to turn things around if they're representing what Abraham Lincoln called the public sentiment, if they're representing public opinion. Isn't that encouraging? We did it with a fraction of 1% to regulate the auto industry, regulate the water polluters. We did it with knowledge, with dissemination, with strategic focus on the decision maker, 535 members of Congress, senators and representatives, and possibly a few thousand people around the country helping out. But if you go to 1%, you cannot name a major secular problem in Canada that you cannot dramatically improve. Our countries have a ton of solutions on the shelf and a ton of problems we don't deserve on the ground because we have a democracy gap, we have a civic engagement gap. And if we're going to continue to allow education to teach us how to grow up powerless, which they do a very good job of, all the way to graduate school, we're taught in so many ways, get along by going along. We're taught to believe rather than to dissent. We're taught to believe rather than to think. If that is continued, then the very reservoir of a deliberative democracy is sabotaged. So I'm glad you really asked that question, because we have a PIRG movement in the United States. We have some of the most powerful citizen groups. Our student PIRGs with full-time staff, New York PIRG, Massachusetts PIRG, but it's not enough. It's got to go all over the country and all over the provinces. That's how you get the new generation. That's how you get the 1% to turn our countries around. So they meet the promise. They meet their pretensions. We don't have all that much time, you know. When you think of the triggers of modern, out-of-control technology, warned about by Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and others, when you see the trigger connection with nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons and the decentralization of using those weapons, we don't have all that much time. A couple terrorist attacks on the U.S., and there goes the rest of our democracy. We have a police state because we massively overreact, because concentration of power is what the parties want. It's what the corporations want. They take advantage of these disasters and strip us of our habeas corpus and of our rights to expression and so on. That's why you should see Michael Moore's new movie called Fahrenheit 11/9. I just saw it last night. Michael Moore came out of our office. I have a lot of criticism of Michael. This is his greatest movie. And it's not filling the seats. He's telling us about Trump. He's telling us about Nazi Germany in the 30s. He's telling us about how our fragile democracies can be flipped in ways so powerful that you walk out of that movie, you want to walk back and see it again. And it's not filling the seats. In 1,800 theaters in the U.S. opened last Friday. It's not filling half the seats. That's a very bad sign. We have to wake each other up, stop making excuses for ourselves, and keep saying we're otherwise preoccupied and predisposed. We don't have time for democracy. Democracy has no time for us. I'm sorry to give you a sermon, but I'm the last paranoid on earth. And it's time for urgent communication to the younger generation. And get them off that cell phone, and get them off that text messaging, and get them out of virtual reality, and get them to stare you in the eyes and have civil conversations that raise their sense of significance as citizens in a democracy begging for their engagement. They don't have a high estimate of their own significance. They don't have high expectations.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nader. I think it's time for a few words of thanks. It's time for a few words of thanks at the end of our evening. First of all, to our panel as a whole, but most especially to you, Mr. Nader, for being here with us this evening and sharing with us the type of, I think you could call it, indignant optimism for which you are so well respected and, in fact, famous for around the world. So we thank you. We thank you very much for being with us.
Did they see that, Michael? Did they see that? Wonderful.
Again, we'd like to thank our donors, Sean and Kush Singh, for making the entire evening possible for us this evening. I'll just point out that the Criminology 50th activities carry on over the course of the week. There's a full schedule of events over the course of the week that culminate in 2 conferences on Friday, one for professors and their student collaborators and collaborators elsewhere on Friday, and then Student Works in Progress conference on Saturday, and a number of events throughout the week available on the webpage. We must thank a professor who couldn't be here with us this evening, Justin Pichet, who, along with a team of professors, in fact, carried the lion's share of the load in organizing this particular event and most of the events for the week. He'll be at many of them, but he couldn't be here with us this evening, so we thank Justin in his absence. Thank you. And finally, as we mentioned, Mr. Nader is very kindly to offer to sign books in the rotunda at the front of the building. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.